Okay, we're here today with Darcy DePoe. My name is Alan Pierce. Darcy DePoe, for those of us that come to Edmonton and work in Edmonton, is well known. He's one of the best known criminal defense lawyers in Edmonton and really in northern Alberta. He's a 34-year call. He's incredibly experienced and is almost certainly one of the first lawyers I met. And in the interests of full frank disclosure, I consider Darcy a good friend, so I'm far from impartial on any of this. And he's very graciously taken time out of his day to talk with us here. Now, and just by give one statistic, he's done something ridiculous, like almost 100 homicide trials or something. I mean, the point is, the guy is a staple of the Edmonton Defense Bar, criminal defense bar. And Darcy has very graciously, we're going to talk about a lot of things, but one thing that, in addition to being a great lawyer, Darcy's very well known for, and this would be my phrase, for being an activist or being an organizer and being a leader of the defense bar. And one of the things that he's very, very knowledgeable about is legal aid. Okay, and he's how legal aid works in Alberta and how it might work in other provinces and what changes we might make to legal aid. And I know he's incredibly strong on these issues. So, Darcy, I wondered, I mean, first of all, maybe you could talk about how does legal aid work in Alberta? Is it part of the government? Is it a separate, how does that work? Tell me about that.
Well, a bit of history might be in order.
Sure.
Legal aid was established as a body in Alberta in the early 70s. There was an obvious need for a legal aid service. Prior to that, in serious cases, counsel would be appointed by the court and sometimes paid something and sometimes not. So in the early 70s, the Attorney General and the Law Society got together and they established a legal aid program, which quickly morphed into something called the Legal Aid Society. And a society, of course, is a private entity. It's a private corporation, basically. And that is the model that has been used to deliver legal aid ever since. And it's subject to what is called a governance agreement, which is an agreement signed, entered into by the Attorney General, Legal Aid, the Legal Aid Society, and the Law Society. In reality, what has developed is that the Attorney General effectively controls the budget of legal aid, which of course dictates the kind of services and the level of services that legal aid can provide in Alberta. And under the long rule of the Conservative government, legal aid has been chronically underfunded. The financial eligibility guidelines for applicants have been very low. The tariff, which is used to pay lawyers, has been very low. The current government, the recently elected NDP government, has promised a review of these things, and we expect some announcements to come in the near future. But most of us are of the view that broader, larger systemic changes are needed, and that we should take the provision of legal aid away from a private corporation, a private society, and make it a branch or a government, but independent. And independent in the sense that the budget is not controlled directly by the Attorney General. It's not just a line in the Justice Department budget, but it is something that is set by the legislature, and that it's something that can be openly debated and discussed, and so that the real needs of legal aid in this province can begin to be met. It's never going to be perfect, but the situation now is dire. There are far too many unrepresented people appearing in Alberta courts.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the phrase fee eligibility guidelines. What would, and again, am I correct in thinking, and I probably have, I don't know as well as you, but am I correct in thinking that's sort of the borderline on who gets to qualify for legal aid?
Financial eligibility guidelines, or FEGs as they're
Thanks.
known, is the threshold for legal aid coverage. And if you go to the legal aid website and look at just how low those guidelines are, you'll see that most people do not qualify.
Right.
And somebody, you know, a single person who makes $15,000 or $20,000 a year doesn't qualify.
Right.
And so there's a huge swath of the population that can't possibly afford a lawyer but do not qualify for legal aid. And these are the people who end up in our courts, and not just in criminal courts, but in family court and so on, without counsel. And you know, that might have worked in the early 70s, but the law is much more complicated now. The stakes are much higher, and we see this kind of rank unfairness in court every single day.
Right. Now, one thing actually, just while we're talking about that, to give that sort of some perspective, there was some discussion in the media under the previous administration where even people on AISH were making too much money. Was that also your experience, or have there been changes since that, or do you
Well, the
recall
financial
that?
eligibility guidelines were raised by the Prentice government just enough so that people who were receiving AISH, and for
Right.
those who don't know, AISH is assured income for the severely handicapped.
Right.
So in other words, you've got people who are essentially unable to look after themselves, who are given a monthly amount of money so that they can live with a minimum level of dignity, and it's around $1,500 a month.
Right.
For those people, the guidelines were raised sufficiently so that they would have legal aid coverage. Because the juxtaposition of people who require AISH and yet being told they have to go to court without a lawyer was just, it's completely untenable, and really was a pressure point, and maybe the worst example of just how unfair the legal aid system is.
Right. And so, and when we're using the phrase AISH, again, there'll likely be you know, people from, students maybe from Ontario and things like that, right? Somebody that's on AISH, you know, Alberta's a pretty right-wing thing, you know, well, why are we giving people money at all? The types of people that you're talking about that are on AISH
Are mentally and physically
right.
disabled people.
Right, right, yeah.
You're talking about people with schizophrenia and
Right.
people who are unable to work. Those are the kind of people that get AISH.
Right.
And who deserve, of course,
Right.
some kind of assistance.
Right.
But these same people were not being given legal aid if they happen to need legal services.
Yeah, and again, the point being, I mean, it's very easy, I think, to sort of wash over it. These are naturally sympathetic people, the
Yes,
people on AISH,
of course,
right? I mean,
course.
like, you're left wing, you're right wing, who the hell are you, right? I mean, these are people with severe disabilities.
That's right.
Right, and we're using the power of the state to come and get them, you know.
Right.
It's absolutely. I mean, it'd be as given my line of work, is actually not something that comes up with any certainty. But
Yeah.
when it was explained to me by people like yourself and by you specifically, I mean, it's hard to. It's shocking.
Yes, it is shocking. It is shocking. Imagine someone with schizophrenia who commits some minor crime, but who might be looking at going to jail, going to court to represent himself.
Right.
I mean, it's an outrage.
Right, and it could be something incredibly complicated. For example, you could be dealing with a search warrant or something like that, right?
You'd be dealing with something as simple as a street check and a frisking of a pocket and finding a couple of pills that the guy shouldn't have.
Right.
I mean, it's any number of things.
Fair enough. Okay. Now, you were talking about the tariff. Now, off the top of your head, do you know what the nominal rate is?
The nominal rate for the tariff is now $84 an hour.
Okay, 84. Now, again,
But that doesn't mean
and
that
this, yeah.
you do not earn $84 an hour.
Okay.
For example, I'll give you a couple of examples. If you're doing a bail hearing in provincial court, you're given 1 hour. So you're expected to do a bail hearing for $84.
Right.
And that includes the time you spend going to court, and the time you spend preparing, and the time you spend actually in court doing the application. You could end up spending 2 or 3 or 4 hours on this application, so you're really making $30 an hour, or $25 an hour, or sometimes even less. And you can look in the courtroom and look around the courtroom, and you'll observe that the defense lawyer is the least well-paid person in the courtroom, including clerks and sheriffs and everybody else.
Right, and again, you're breaking it on even onto an hourly rate. I think you came down with something in the $30 range. But does any of that include the disbursements, or do you have to pay for that yourself?
You do get some disbursements. There's a list, of course, that you're permitted to claim for. You can ask for coverage for special disbursements. You can ask for coverage for an expert, for example. But getting back to the hourly rate,
right.
It's appallingly low.
Right, and again, sorry, I probably should have. I wanted to talk about overhead, for example.
Right.
Like
well, some people might think $84 an hour. Boy, that sounds pretty good.
Right, exactly.
But you're not making $84 an hour, as
right.
I just pointed out. The second thing is, you're not putting in 8 or 10 hours of $84
right.
In a day necessarily. Right. But even if you were, if you calculate say a 40 or a 50-hour week on $84 an hour, and say spread that over a month, and then you compare it to the monthly expenses of running an office,
right.
It's not possible to make money that way.
Right.
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 And a lawyer is a professional and deserves a reasonable level of income.
Right.
And no one's saying lawyers should get rich on legal aid, but lawyers shouldn't have to impoverish themselves to take on that responsibility either.
That's fair enough. You're preaching to the choir on that one. I mean, the schooling itself, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about your own education.
Well, my own education, I was 4 years of undergraduate training,
right.
and 3 years of law school, and a
right.
year of articling
yep.
before you get admitted to the bar. So it's